Yes, I would say aside from, feeling like, okay, I'm living more simply, and I like to say I'm not a minimalist, I'm a specialist because I have, 6 pairs of shoes, but I have a silly amount of music toys.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 239 with Annie Corbett. One of my favorite things to do on this podcast is to speak directly with a real live tiny house dweller and find out kind of what makes them tick, why they decided to go tiny, what they did in the process of designing and building their house to make it unique for them, and how living tiny has been for them. And that's what I do today with my guest, Annie Corbett. I found out about Annie because she released a hilarious music video about, well, what goes down in the tiny house loft, which is really fun, and I suggest you watch it. You'll find it linked on the show notes page for this episode. But Annie has just a really sweet tiny house life, and I really enjoyed exploring it with her. And I think you'll find a lot of inspiration and wisdom in this conversation. I hope you stick around. Thank you so much to everyone who attended the 2022 Tiny House Summit last week. The reviews and feedback are humbling and really makes it all worthwhile for me. So if you attended, if you sent me an email or left a comment on the Summit Hub, I want to personally thank you for doing that. I really enjoyed putting it together. If you want to catch that summit content, you can still watch it. It's called the All Access Pass, gives you lifetime access to all 30 sessions. That's over 15 hours of tiny house knowledge and wisdom, plus a bunch of bonuses. And for podcast listeners, I'm offering $50 off the cost of the All Access Pass using the coupon code THLP. So again, use the coupon code THLP to get $50 off the All Access Pass. If you want to learn more about the Tiny House Summit, you can go to tinyhousesummit.co. There you'll find all of the speakers, their topics, their bios, and even short preview videos of each of the sessions. And you'll also find links to the All Access Pass there. Again, head over to tinyhousesummit.co and click on the All Access Pass. Use the coupon code THLP for $50 off. All right, I am here with Annie Corbett, known by the artist name Annie C., is a Portland, Oregon-based musician who has lived in her tiny home, The Green Dream, since 2017. Her music is featured in the documentary Damned to Extinction, on the 350.org compilation Protect What You Love, and in the film Falling South. She recorded her 2017 release, Shadows Insight, entirely in her tiny home. She just released a new EP, Aligning, this September. It features Tiny House Loft, a song and video that shows the humorous side of romance in a small space. She is also starting a YouTube channel showcasing everyday tiny house living. Annie Corbett, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So, the Tiny House Loft song was kind of my introduction to you, and it's kind of like it's like Let's Get It On for the tiny house movement.
Exactly. Make conservation sexy. Why not?
Yeah. It's a really fun song, and the video is really well put together. So I'll it'll definitely be in the show notes description for this, so anyone listening can go and check out the video. But so 2017 to now, is 5 years. That's a pretty long time in the tiny house movement age. Can you talk about how you got interested in tiny house living, and kind of what it was like, having a house built, and how long that whole process took?
Sure, definitely. So I started thinking about tiny house living probably a few years prior to that, probably
Uh-huh.
2013, 2014-ish. And I think that seems like sort of when it kind of hit maybe a more popular mainstream. And I started hearing about that a little bit more. So at the time, I was renting rooms in people's homes, and being a musician and having kind of an
Mhm.
odd schedule, and also wanting to, create whenever inspiration would strike, I started thinking about, I would love to have a more detached space. I started thinking about possibly van life or RV life. And I ultimately started pursuing tiny house living more seriously because I'm kind of a
Hmm.
wuss when it comes to the cold and I wanted actual house insulation.
Yep. Yep.
And so, about, I would say, a year before I found the house I'm living in, I started the process of, I know you've talked about sort of the tiny home decisions, and
Hmm.
I started talking with people who had built their homes. I started looking at online used tiny home listings, and I talked to builders. I had a friend of mine who has an architect background, my friend Emily, accompany me to some of the visits to the builders.
Hmm.
And I ultimately decided to work with builders because I wanted something that was built to code. The people I knew and the stories that I heard from people who have built their own homes, it seemed like it always took a lot longer than they expected. And I built a bed frame once and I built the couch that I have, but I don't have a lot of building experience. So that seemed like the right fit for me. And I ended up finding some builders who are pretty local, based out of Salem. And
Hmm.
we basically modified kind of one of their basic plans, essentially.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Well, in your tiny home tours video, it really looks like you've done some customization that you've talked about,
Mhm.
like building out the couch storage to specifically fit different pieces of
Mhm.
musical equipment. Can you talk a little
Mhm.
bit about those modifications and those things that you've done since moving in?
Sure. Yes, and I think this brings up a good point that when I was starting to look at different homes, tiny houses,
Hmm.
I saw several models that had sort of custom, furniture built in. And I found, for me, I like to have a little bit more space to kind of do yoga and stretch. And I found that the homes that sort of built out from the side, those felt really cramped to me.
Mm.
So I knew that I wanted sort of a basic kind of shell, not a shell completely, but I didn't want anything built in. I wanted to live in it for a time and figure out what I wanted. And so when the pandemic hit and I was spending a lot more time in my house, I previously just kind of had my music equipment out kind of loose at the end of the house. But it was at that time that I decided, okay, I basically have these three sort of table shelves, and you can see it in the video.
Okay.
And then on top of that, I put a little mattress. So it sort of functions as a couch. But
Okay.
I measured the width of my speakers and my loop pedal to sort of figure out how big each of the little subdivision tables would be.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then I tried to make the height a good height where I could sort of get on, get off the couch
Yeah.
relatively
Yeah.
easily. Yeah.
Well, it's great. It definitely, like, in your tour, and I don't mean this as an insult at all. It looks lived in. Like
Mhm.
it's refreshing because it's not
Yeah.
like a tiny house that's you know brand new, that's just been delivered, that maybe nobody lives in yet. It's
Mhm.
clear that you live there and you've made the modifications that you need to kind of make it work.
Right, exactly, and that's what I wanted to show, and that's what I'm starting to show on my YouTube channel for the Green Dream as well, as sort of the everyday tiny house living, because when I was researching tiny homes, I saw a lot of tours that, as you said, looked like, "Oh, this house was just delivered," or it's sort of a
Hmm.
model, and I wanted to see, well, what is it actually like to live in it? What is it like to cook in it? And how do you figure out where your things go? So that's what I'm trying to show a little bit more in that space. And so, yeah, I'm glad that you noticed that.
Yeah, and I actually, it's an interesting point. The conventional wisdom, I think, is to go with the built-ins because it can save a little space. It's just a little bit
Hmm.
more efficient, but I think that your house is probably much more adaptable. Those
Hmm.
built-ins are pretty hard to change, especially if you don't put flooring under them. If you're like, I'm building the couch in here and I'm going to save space on the floors by not putting in hardwood flooring underneath.
Right.
That's hard to change down the line.
Exactly. I like that customization, I can pull my music gear out and play with it in the middle of the room. I can
Mm-hmm.
stretch, I can do yoga. And I know some of the homes that I saw, you really it was hard to have that sort of space that is adaptable in that way for different activities. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what I wanted.
Well, that's fantastic. Um, you know, you mentioned in the tour, that there are some things that you change about the house. Would you mind kind of sharing those here and elaborating on those?
Sure. That was sort of a hard question to answer, um, because I feel pretty good about the size. I feel good that I didn't get different, something that was more complicated or had more built-ins. The one thing that I did mention in the video is I am in the Pacific Northwest and it
Hmm.
can be a bit gray. And the
Yep.
spot that I'm in actually have some really nice shade for the summer, but I'm in a cedar house, and so, it's got a bit more of a cabin feel, and so it can feel like there are times that I want a little more light, and
Hmm.
those are when I do watch other people's tiny home tours who have built-in skylights, I do think about that at times, but I know that that would involve kind of losing some of that roof insulation and making it a
Yeah.
bit colder, but there are times I would like a bit more light. That was what I mentioned in that tour.
Yeah, definitely. I also struggled with that decision to put a skylight in or not. And ultimately I also decided not to put in the skylight
Mhm.
for those kind of similar longevity reasons of like being nervous that it would leak over time.
Right, right. Yeah, other than that, there's not a lot I can think that I would change. It really feels like it fit it fits my lifestyle pretty well.
Yeah. So what has it been like kind of adapting to being a musician and making music in the tiny house?
Yes, I would say aside from, feeling like, okay, I'm living more simply, and I like to say I'm not a minimalist, I'm a specialist
I
because I
like it.
have, 6 pairs of shoes, but I have a silly amount of music toys.
Yeah.
So aside from living more simply and living lighter on the land, that's been one of my favorite things about living in the tiny home is that
Hmm.
and where I have it, I'm not very close to the main house or any of the neighbors. And so there have been
Hmm.
times I've practiced at 11 at night, have a gig coming up and I'll practice, I'll write at night. Like I said, being able to move things around and I've recorded in here, as you mentioned. I forgot that I put
Yep.
that on my bio, but my 2017 release, I recorded almost entirely in the tiny house and it was mixed here as well.
Yeah.
So we brought in, a drummer, set up his my drummer set up his hand drums in here, and so that's been super fun. We've even had, band rehearsals in here. I've gotten 6 people in here, and we call it the cram jam. So so it's been, it's fun. Definitely a blessing to have that space. I know that that's a challenge for a lot of musicians, and yeah.
Yeah, definitely. You live in your practice space.
Right, exactly. I have my instruments on my wall. I can see some behind you as well.
Yes,
Um,
yes. I have a
yeah.
few stringed instruments back there as well. I liked in your tour that you mentioned like when you were preparing for the tiny house that you were willing to give a lot of things away, but like never any musical gear. And I personally feel
Yeah,
the same. Like I refuse to get rid of any musical instruments like ever. So
right.
they follow me around.
Exactly. You can hang them on the walls.
Yep.
You
Yep.
can, you can find places for them.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
Did you have to bring in more equipment, to record that album, or were you just able to, use your computer and just what you had locally in the house?
I think that I did. I think I basically used everything here. I had gotten a pretty good vocal microphone. I think there was anything I brought in. No, it was basically all what I had
Hmm.
and in this space, with the exception of there's one drummer on one song who was up in Seattle. And so I recorded
Yeah.
him there, but
Cool.
everything else was here. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, what you can do now with just like a Mac laptop and
Hmm.
a few microphones.
Right. Logic and a few microphones and
Yep. Yep. Are you a Logic person?
I am now. I used
Nice.
GarageBand for quite a while and
Yep.
then got into Logic, and Logic is just sort of the next step from
Yep.
GarageBand.
Yep.
And I find it's very intuitive. And then I started getting in. a little bit into the video editing to do some of the tiny home videos, and Final
Yeah.
Cut is also sort of like related, it seems,
Mm-hmm.
to Logic and GarageBand. So those are all sort of in the same intuitive family. So
Yeah.
little plug for
Yeah.
those. They want to sponsor
Definitely.
us.
Yeah. Apple, please come sponsor
Yeah,
me, sponsor Annie. Like we would love to take your money because
totally.
we know we've given you plenty. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what has your experience been parking the tiny home? Have you had a lot of different parking spots, or, tell that story?
Yeah. Yes. So I've been in one location for the 5 years, and we were just mentioning that I will be
Wow.
moving in a couple of weeks. My partner and I have lived on opposite sides of town. And so we have some friends with a little bit more space, a little bit east of here. And so we're rolling the tiny house over, and we're going to have space in the house, which is great because he's also a musician. So I will get to see what that adventure is like in a couple of weeks,
Wow.
but I haven't moved it.
Yeah. And I mean, how lucky to have been able to live in your house for
Hmm.
that many years. And also, you're not moving it under duress. Like you haven't had a falling
Right.
out with your landlord, or like the city hasn't come
Exactly.
knocking. You're just moving because you want to move.
Exactly. It's one of the, it's the happiest move I'll be
Yeah.
making.
Yeah. It sounds like a very happy move.
Yeah, and to find my spot, that is actually kind of an interesting part of the story.
Yeah,
So
please.
I know you've talked about, and this is still the case in a lot of areas where people told me so I'm in Portland,
Mm-hmm.
that it was pre-legal at the time that I moved in. That
Yep.
it wasn't technically illegal, but there just weren't the laws saying yes, you can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was my biggest concern moving into a tiny house.
Okay.
So I would say a few months, 6 months or so before I decided on the house that I'm in, I posted a Craigslist ad just saying, this is, about me and the likely dimensions of the house, and just seeing if people had space for it. And I got a lot of what I was surprised by how many responses I got. I was getting probably 3 to 4 a week.
Wow.
And so through that process, I met my landlords,
Landmates. I like
and
that.
and I'm just behind the main house. So that was another thing I really liked about this location, is that it's very stealth. It's not
Mm-hmm.
visible from the road, it's not out in a driveway or anything like that.
Yep.
And the neighbors around me, I'm basically facing their yards. So I'm also not very close to their homes. So I haven't had any problems with that, and I know I'm really lucky in that way. And since then, it is now legal, technically legal, to be in
Yeah.
an RV or a tiny house in Portland. So
Yeah, it's awesome, and
yeah.
I don't know the episode number off the top of my head, but I will put it in the show notes if anyone's interested in hearing about the Portland laws. I had someone
Mm.
on who is very knowledgeable about that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Check that out.
So what are you doing? So your house has been in place for 5 years. What are you doing to
Mhm.
prepare for the move?
Yes. So since I haven't moved, I'm sort of trying to feel out what I should do. I talked to the tiny house mover who said that I can keep things in my house. So
Mm-hmm.
my plan is to move. I have a storage loft. I have a sleeping loft and a
Mm-hmm.
storage loft. And I'm planning to take things out of the storage loft.
Yeah.
I'll probably move a few things ahead of time to the main house. I'll definitely take my music gear out.
Yep.
But other than that, I don't have a lot of very breakable things. I think it's going to be a lot of, oh, and the dishes. I'll take the dishes out.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to be duct taping drawers and cabinets.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't feel, it's sort of like having your own moving truck in a way.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So for my recent move, I forgot to take the globe off of the ceiling fan, the like glass globe that covers the
Yeah.
light bulb. And that fell off during the move and just shattered
Oh,
everywhere. But
no.
I actually took like all of the dishes and stuff. I just
Mhm.
had a couple of like those plastic, totes
Mhm.
And I just
Right.
kind of layered the dishes with like either clothes or like clean dish towels and other type
Mhm.
things, and just put those right on the floor of the tiny house. And that's
Mm.
kind of all you need. I
Yeah.
see some pictures behind you. I would take those
Yeah.
off the wall too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pictures, but it doesn't feel like it feels strange because it feels weird to move and not have all these boxes or have this, you know, kind of scramble to really pack things in that conventional way.
Yeah.
But more about, like you said, strategizing what you're going to move and what to kind of protect on the
Definitely.
road.
It's not something that most people have to think about. Like, if you are living van life or schoolie life, like you're probably used to moving it more often. And then if you're
Mm-hmm.
in a stationary house, you move, but you have to pack everything in boxes. So it's rare to have like a house that's built like a single family home, but also have it move.
Right, right. Going on the road.
Going on the road. So I'm curious, like when you were kind of dreaming and then building your tiny house, did you think of it like this is going to be my forever thing, or were you like,
Mm.
okay, I'm going to do this for 3 years and then reevaluate? Like, what was your thought process there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that at the time, I think at the time it was more about, gosh, I really would love this to have a situation where like I said, I can just create at any time and I'm sort of
Mhm.
detached from having to worry about making noise with other people around. And at the time, I remember talking with people, what if at that time I hadn't met my partner and all of this. And so my vision was really kind of what I'll be moving into, which is if I meet someone and we find a place together, that can be part of it. That can be the studio in the backyard, or that I envisioned keeping the house with me in some capacity. And I think being a musician, we could turn it into a little studio and that would be sort of a novel, fun thing potentially. And I guess it sounds sort of weird. I don't know if other people, I imagine if you've built your own house, you feel very attached. But when I did get the house, I feel very attached to it, that
Yeah.
maybe at some point I would, you know, sell it. But yeah, it almost feels like a pet in a certain way that I want to keep it with me in some
Yeah.
capacity.
Yeah. Um, tell us about the name, The Green Dream.
Oh, sure. So it's green on the outside.
Okay.
And I don't know when I came up with that. I mean, it rhymes. In my videos, I have a little goofy jingle.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just seemed like it fit.
Does fit. I like it. Well, you also talked about your wanting to live more lightly on the earth. So there's like the green,
Yeah.
green
Right,
living.
exactly, exactly. Mhm. Green living, the green color,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that it had been a dream for a few years at that point, and so,
Yeah.
yeah, kind of actualizing that.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And so you're starting to do, have you started it yet, or are you going to start doing like a YouTube channel sharing your day-to-day life?
Yes, so I just posted the videos, the tour on the
Yep.
tiny home tours came out,
Yep.
and that was my plan to sort of when that came out, I would post the videos. I was kind of waiting to do the jingle and they sort of surprised me posting the video. And so
Yep.
I just that day just okay, gonna lo-fi it. But so I just posted a few videos and I have a couple more in the pipeline. And I think there's gonna
Hmm.
be several about the move, like you said, kind of preparing and then what is the actual move gonna be like. The location that I'm in when they delivered the house, they had to sort of jackknife it back here, if that makes sense. So I
Ah,
think the extraction will be interesting to
okay.
see. And yeah, so I'm planning to share that adventure. People want to check it out.
Nice. And have you hired professional movers, or are
Hmm.
you doing it yourself?
I have hired a professional mover for that reason because I
Yep.
knew
Yep.
it would be challenging for just anyone with a truck to get it out of the location.
Uh-huh.
But I definitely want to really observe everything that they do so that I'm more self-sufficient with that in the future. But I think
Uh-huh.
for this move, since it's been a while, I haven't moved it at all, and it's a tricky location that wanted to go with a pro.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's a good way to do it. I've never moved mine myself really
Mm,
either because I think it's worth it to hire somebody with the right equipment and expertise.
right. Right. Was it nerve-wracking the first time you moved your house?
Oh, it's always nerve-wracking seeing it
Yeah.
roll. It's crazy.
Mhm.
Um, but for the person towing it, it's just towing another thing. It's not
Mhm.
that big of a deal. But to you and me, it's like it's our house.
It's a bit right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I had a friend come. I mean, since it's been here for 5 years, I was, making sure, okay, I gotta make sure that's another thing I did. I made sure
Mhm.
the tires were at a certain PSI, I think
Yep.
65.
Yep.
And then I had a friend come over so we could test the light.
Yep.
So it has the signal light.
Hmm.
And he was saying that you could have he said a forklift. Basically, a forklift could move your house, and
Wow.
that those are very maneuverable. So I had never
Yes,
thought about that.
that is true.
So maybe in the future, that'll be fun to
Yeah.
see.
I actually, my house stayed in the same spot for a long time before it moved, and the wheels had kind of sunken into the ground a bit, and
Yeah.
there was a tractor on the property and that was what we used to pull it out because it was
Oh wow.
it was slightly stuck. But
Wow.
tractor's also very maneuverable for towing a tiny house.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Good to know.
So how often do you perform and play out, and like are you able to store all your like live gear with you at the
Hmm.
tiny house?
Yes. So I would say I perform every month or so. I kind of go through waves. I'm just,
Hmm.
finishing this EP that I just released called Aligning in September, and I'm gonna have a video coming out the end of October.
Hmm.
And so I would say I play about every month or so publicly.
Okay.
I have toured in the past, not since the pandemic,
Hmm.
and kind of feeling that out, what I want to do there. But I do
Yeah.
play regularly in assisted living and elder care facilities
Nice.
2 to 3 times a week.
Wow.
So I have my PA set up, and I usually
Hmm.
bring one of those speakers. So I have all my gear very accessible. It Before I had the couch, some of it was in the storage loft, and I would have to kind of
Yeah.
bring things up and down. So it's nice to have everything out. But yeah, all the music gear is in here.
Definitely. Yeah, and it's just so cool because, you think of somebody who is a musician and you think about all their gear and you're like, well, they probably couldn't live in a tiny house. But
Right,
they really can.
right. That's why I say specialist. You think
Yeah.
about, okay, what do I want to keep with me?
Uh-huh.
And I think the biggest thing that I never had a lot of clothes. I think in other areas of my life, I am a little bit more of a natural minimalist, but
Yeah.
I did throughout different moves in my adult life. I kept shedding books. I used to keep all books with me, and then I realized, there might be a couple of books that I would like to keep, but I would rather read something and pass it along. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I just have a few books up in my sleeping loft, and the rest kind of cycle through, And there's
Nice.
libraries, and yeah, so I think a lot of it's about, if you're an artist or there's something that is important to you, and you want to build your space around that, and then keep everything else as simple as possible. I think it's very, very doable.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any like renovations or changes or things that you're kind of looking ahead to in the tiny house?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the ceiling fan, because I do have wiring for a
Ah.
ceiling fan that I've never put in, and it would be nice to have that. Right now I have a little fan at the one of the
Mhm.
small back windows, and that's kind of what I use for the sort of, ventilation and air movement, but it would be nice to have
Yep.
a ceiling fan. What else have I thought about? Oh, a slightly more permanent deck in the
Okay.
in the tour video. I have this. It was a little cheap kind of canvas thing that I put on it, slightly crooked. What else? Renovations. I think that's another place where I'm sort of a little bit more of a minimalist that I just kind of wanted my little box.
Yeah.
Nothing
Yeah.
too complicated. There's this drawer that always opens that I'm kind of taping shut, but nothing major, I would
Nothing
say.
major. Okay.
Yeah.
Ceiling fan, drawer
Ceiling
repair.
fan, drawers. I don't know. I think that's it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, one thing that I like to ask all my guests is, what are 2 or 3 resources that maybe helped you out on your tiny house journey, or just things that inspire you in
Mm.
general, just and that you want to share with the listeners?
Sure. Since it's been a little while, I'm trying to remember the particular.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that my friend and my friend who helped accompanied me to the visit
Mm-hmm.
with the builders. I'm sure we watched one of those reality shows
Yeah.
that featured tiny homes. And I don't remember which one it was, but I remember we sort of binge watched a few episodes of that show. I know that I went on YouTube a lot, and I was,
Yeah.
especially when I wasn't sure about, do I get a van, RV, tiny house? And so I watched a ton of different videos of people in those situations. I think this was before I was really on Instagram a lot, but definitely a lot
Okay.
of YouTube, just YouTube random random shuffle and looking at
Definitely.
different places. And then like I said, just going out. I think being in Portland, I was fortunate to have access to, I knew different people or friends of friends who had built homes. There's a spot up here, Green Anchors, where there's a lot of
Yep.
building going
Yep.
on. So just visiting homes, I looked at some tumbleweed houses. So yeah, just physically, uh, getting a physical sense for a lot of different tiny homes was very helpful. I got to really see, I think I saw a used shell that was a 16-foot tiny house, and I realized that is way too small. I'm not going that tiny. Or
Yeah,
seeing
that's really
places.
tiny.
The big thing for me was, and I'm not that tall, but
Mm-hmm.
I went to several tiny homes where I could barely sit in the loft, and that didn't feel great. So the builders that I worked with, they actually build their own trailers a bit lower to the ground, so they have a little more height in the loft.
Okay.
And that was a big deciding factor for me. Yeah, just it's sort of like trying on clothes, what fits, and maybe the leg's too long or the sleeves are too short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's great advice. Annie Corbett, thanks so much for being a guest on the show today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Ethan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much to Annie Corbett for being a guest on the show today. You can find the show notes, including a complete transcript, photos of Annie's house, and some of her music, including that hilarious Tiny House Loft music video, over at thetinyhouse.net/239. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/239. Well, that's all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.